Hi, we continue today in 1 Samuel 23 and complete the chapter with one more chase scene. But it's not just one more chase scene, as if the authors had nothing better to do than just to repeat the same story of Saul chasing David and David getting away over and over. Each of these scenes, as we look at them closely, shows another step in the process of Saul losing the authority that Yahweh gave him, not only because Yahweh's spirit was taken away from him, as we saw much earlier, but because the people were moving away from him and moving closer to David. It's not a linear path. As today we'll see folks loyal to Saul, and David will escape from them. But as we continue through the rest of the chapter, rest of the book, we're going to see increasingly that David's strength is growing and Saul's strength is diminishing. And any sympathy in the audience for Saul certainly should have left after the priests of Nob were killed, and the entire town of Nob was killed. But the Ziphites are still on his side for reasons we'll see in just a minute. So we've been following this chiasm through the second half of 1 Samuel, and we're now in the E part here. The brown part is David is hiding in the area of Ziph, and we'll see that's closely parallel to chapter 26. In fact, we'll look today briefly at how what the Ziphites say here in 23:19 is very similar to what they say in 26:1, and we'll have to look later at the relationship between those. And now we're on the final scene of what we've been following in these three chapters, in chapter 21 to 23, Saul seeking David's life in the wilderness of Maon. We're also continuing to look at how so much of the knowledge that each David and Saul has is indirect and coming from rumors. Today we're going to hear one of the few times where explicit source is given. The Ziphites told Saul, but otherwise we hear all this passive. It was told Saul, David learned, etc. And we'll see even today, I am told without knowing from whom, and when David was told. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and perhaps that's symbolic of the fact there's a lot going on under the surface. And we'll see today that there's a curious way the authors have put an image in this passage that echoes not only what we just saw in the last scene with David and Jonathan making their final covenant, but recalling episodes of David and Jonathan earlier in 1 Samuel in contrast with Saul. So we'll see that as the story unfolds. So the Ziphites are in Ziph, right? And they're here. And so the area we've been looking at here is that David was in the forest of Hereth earlier. In the last scene, he had protected the people of Keilah, but when the people of Keilah were told, or David was told the people of Keilah would surrender him to Saul, then he left and went down to this area, and that's where he is now. And we're going to look at the Google Maps too to see a little bit of what this area looks like, because there's some descriptions in the text that it isn't clear from this colorful flat map of what's actually going on. And we're continuing to follow key words as we've been. We're in this paragraph here today, and you can see how many times David and Saul are mentioned, especially in the last half. We all know who's at stake here, and we see Saul mentioned and David mentioned a lot in the early scene too in Keilah, and obviously here in the middle scene, but especially here. I didn't include as a key word, because it seems so everyday, the repeated use of "and his men," but we hear it a number of times, and I'll point it out in the text as we go, that sometimes we're told Saul and his men, or David and his men went, but sometimes it just seems like it's Saul and David one-on-one. So with that in mind, let's jump into our story. So then some Ziphites, and so first we're hearing of Ziphites. Ziph is only mentioned here and in the parallel and in the introduction to Psalm 54, which we can see here. To the chief musician with stringed instruments, a contemplation of David when the Ziphites went and said to Saul, "Is David not hiding with us?" Although in the psalm itself, we don't hear that. So those are the only references to Ziphites we have. We saw where generally is on the map, but we know nothing about them otherwise. But what they do immediately is go up to Saul at Gibeah and say, "David is hiding among us in the strongholds of Horosh, on the hill of Hashilah, which is south of Jeshimon." We need to look at those details in just a minute. But the first thing we need to pay attention to is they're obviously reporting David to Saul, and as we were told the people of Keilah would do, but we didn't see happen because David escaped too soon. Why would these people be doing that? Well, the obvious reason is Saul is the king, and as far as they understand, Saul is the king, and perhaps they recognize that David among them is dangerous for them, since they obviously know that Saul is pursuing David, and they want the dangerous person out of their territory. Or, as some scholars have suggested, perhaps David and his men, he has 400, and pretty soon we'll see he has 600, are exploiting their their resources. And we'll see a question of that in the next chapter, or in chapter 25 rather, when David sets out with his men to greet Nabal in Maon, which is a town right where we're going to see in this section. So it may well be that this band of marauding misfits are exploiting the neighbors here, and the Ziphites are concerned about that, but we don't hear that explicitly. Let's look more closely at the description of where they say he is, because Saul is going to question that in great detail. So the verb for hiding shtir here we've seen is a key word in this section. It's not a key word on my chart because it's not a key word in this chapter. It's only once in this chapter, but in this whole section we've been seeing the question of David hiding. In the strongholds of Horish, and then we hear these details. On the hill of Hahilah, which can mean dark or dull or gloomy, especially after drinking wine. So perhaps when the light comes on it, it's a dark hill. South of Jeshimon, noted here in the NORSV as a proper name, but most scholars suggest it simply means desert. And so when we look at the Bible Atlas, we can see that's the area down here. But when we look at it from Google Maps, we can really see what's at issue here. So you can see the town of Maon, which we'll see in just a minute there, and then this wide open desert. So this is very different than what was described earlier as wilderness when we saw the Hebrew word meant hunting grounds, or when the text said, as we saw up here, he was in the forest of Hereth. You could hide pretty well in a forest that has animals in it to be hunted, but in this desert wilderness here, you're pretty darn visible, and we'll see how that plays out in the scene. So the Ziphites continue to Saul, "Now, O king." And we have to wonder, when was the last time someone directly addressed Saul as king? That'd be something worth looking at there. As Fackelman notes, the remarkable word order of 20a is strongly expressive and creates an ascending clause. Only at its end is the predicate revealed to us. It is the command "come down," highlighting that the New RSV here does not have it in the same word order as the Hebrew does. And further, Uriah Kim notes below, David was not yet strong enough to win the allegiance of his own kinsman over against Saul, contrary to the narrator's claim that everybody loves David. So a crack in the narrator's story that everybody's on David's side, but plainly the Ziphites are afraid here. So they say to him, "O king, whenever you wish to come down or desire to come down," we see it in Deuteronomy, but it's only here in Samuel, "come down." It's actually repeated here. "You wish to come down, come down. And our part will be to surrender him into the king's hands." The key word we've seen a number of times as we see it here. So with that promise in mind that if he comes to Ziph, the Ziphites will turn him in, Saul gets very excited, but we need to look more closely at what this tells us about Saul's mood here. Because the Ziphites have said, "We know exactly where he is," and this is what we hear Saul reply, and what's a relatively long speech for the Bible. Saul said, "May you be blessed by the Lord for showing compassion." And that "may you be blessed by the Lord" is one of a number of echoes back to highlight why Saul shouldn't be king. So let's look at this first one from 1 Samuel 15:13, the only other time in 1 Samuel we heard this. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "May you be blessed by the Lord," or by Yahweh. "I have carried out the command of Yahweh." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" And of course, it's because he spared the best of the sheep and cattle. And the word for spared will come up in just a moment again. So one of several echoes back to that scene to remind us that Saul did not do, at least according to Samuel, Yahweh's will. And "may you be blessed by Yahweh for showing me compassion" here. And the word chamel here can usually mean spared. As my note down below from Samura says, words which a king would not normally speak to his subjects. His authority as a leader of the Israelites is now gone, and he only clings to his position for self-preservation. Let's look a little more closely at this word that's translated here as compassion, but not otherwise. It's otherwise translated as to spare, or something related to that. And so precisely in the passage we just looked at from Amalek, "do not spare them." And again, it's repeated that Saul, in fact, did spare not only the sheep, but Agag, their king. And then Saul says that blames it on the people for sparing the best of the sheep and cattle. So there, 3 times we see it's for sparing in the sense of allowing to live. But that's plainly not necessarily compassion. He's not having compassion on the sheep and cattle. He's allowing the people to exploit the fact that sheep and cattle provide food and other things for them. So it's not for the sake of the sheep and cattle. It's obviously for the sake of the people. And in the wonderful story that Nathan tells David, that's a transparent version of the David and Bathsheba and Uriah story, then came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath, or it's the same word, to spare. So he was hesitant to spare one of his own flock for the traveler. And then later on, we'll see King, now David, spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of Yahweh that was between them. So plainly, we could call this compassion, but it's not so much that it's for Mephibosheth, but it is for Jonathan that he does that. So similarly to the oxen here, it's not that the person being spared is because somebody has compassion on them. It's because of some pre-existing situation that allows this person to live. So with that in mind, that's really what we can hear here, is may be blessed by Yahweh for sparing me. For allowing him to live. But the irony is nobody's trying to kill Saul that we know of. And in the next few chapters, in 24 and 26, we'll see that David has two explicit opportunities to kill Saul easily, and he refuses to do it in principle, that he should not harm the Lord's anointed, which Saul was and which David, of course, is. It's not has nothing to do with compassion there. It has to do with sparing, but it's not that Saul's being spared. So this is the beginning of recognizing that Saul has really lost his mind here. And we'll see it in the detail, which at one level is rational, another level makes no sense of what we see in the next two verses. Let's look at that. So go and make sure once more. Now they've just told him we know exactly where he is. It wasn't just some generic place. They said very specifically, we can go back up there and look at that again in case you just forgot, among the strongholds of Horish on this hill. So it's a very specific place. Go and make sure. That word here in the Hiphil form can mean set up as a king, another little play on words for an alert audience. Once more, or always and forever, find out exactly, or more literally, know and see where he is, which they've just said they do. And who has seen him there? For I am told that he is very cunning. As if they don't know that? The word for cunning here, arom yarem, is highlighting it's a doubled verb, as Hebrew so often does to provide emphasis. He's cunning, yes, coming, and it's very close to arum, what the serpent is in Genesis 3:1 here. So not that Saul or the audience of 1 Samuel would know the Genesis story, which is almost certainly written later in the time of exile, but the fact that he has to say that he's cunning to these Ziphites is highlighting the sense that he thinks that he's the only one who has any idea what's going on, even though they know exactly what's going on. They know that Saul's after David, they know where David is, and they know that it's important for them to report it. So Saul is really talking as if he hasn't just heard what they said, but he's not even done yet. Look around. So now he's saying to do what you just said. Go and make sure once more, find and see. Look around and learn, or know, again, all the hiding places where he lurks. And hiding places here is a unique word here, machavo, only here in the Masoretic text, where he lurks. Hav, we've seen that a couple of times earlier, and come back to me with sure information, which is difficult to translate nifal participle here, and something like with something that feels solid or is feeling solid, indicating the participle. Translations vary on that. But regardless of the detail there of how to translate that, notice all the elements in which Saul talks about David like he's some kind of wild animal they're hunting down, where he lurks and he hides and he's cunning, like he's a big cat or something. And it's understandable that Saul, having chased down David a number of times and having gotten there and found David gone, really wants to make sure. And he's not done yet. Then I will go with you. Once you've done all these things, of course, how is he going to know that they've done all these things unless he's with them? And just because they've done all these things, when they come back again, how does he know that David will still be in the same place? So Saul is just talking and talking and talking here, but he's really not adding anything to what's going to unfold. Then I will go with you, and if he is in the land, anywhere in the land, I will search him out among the thousands of Judah. So notice what Saul's done there. He's taken a very specific, he's right here amongst us, to if he's anywhere in the land, I will search him out among the thousands of Judah. What are the chances of Saul finding somebody when his mind is scattered all over the place like that? But with that intro, now they set out. So they set out and went to Ziph ahead of Saul, so the Ziphites go ahead, and David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon. in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. And again, Jeshimon simply means desert, and Arabah itself can simply mean desert, plain, or steppe. So let's look at two views of this from Google Maps so we can see what's at issue here. Because in the next verse, we're going to be told he went to stay at the rock or the crag. And in the initial scene, it doesn't look like there's any place like that. So we look, and here's what's current, the little town of Maon, and you see across this vast, dry desert, which looks relatively flat, although on this close-up here, you can see this crag, and it's not that tall in relation to the broad landscape, but if you were a human being, it'd be plenty tall. And so let's keep that picture in mind as we listen to what follows here. So Saul and his men went to search for him, and when David was told, notice how quickly the messages are going back and forth here. Saul and his men are on the way, and somehow somebody from David's group has gone ahead and gotten the word back before Saul could get there. He went down to the rock or the crag or the cliff here and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard this, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. So it's a chase scene. And we've seen a lot of pursuit, but this one really does, the narrator's voice here really makes it sound like it's a chase scene out of a modern movie. But something important happens in verse 26 that we need to look at closely here. So Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. This is suggesting at one level it's only Saul, but we just saw Saul and his men up here. But the image of on two sides of the mountain brings up two important scenes. One, like Jonathan and the Philistines at Michmash, and the other, the Philistines with David. So we hear back in chapter 14 this. In the pass by which Jonathan tried to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. One crag rose to the north in front of Michmash, and the other in the south in front of Geba. So in other words, a very similar situation with Jonathan on one side and the Philistines on the other. Similarly, in chapter 17, at the beginning of the David and Goliath story, we hear this. The Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So when we get to our scene in chapter 23 with Saul on one side and David on the other, we recognize that this is parallel to situations where Jonathan was successful in defeating Philistines and where David was successful in defeating Philistines. So now, the previous scene that we looked at in the last video, the final encounter between David and Jonathan, makes sense as a signal to remind us when we get to this verse of how Jonathan and David have both been successful at doing what the Israelites asked Samuel to ask Yahweh for in the first place, to have a king, to protect them from their enemies, especially the Philistines. So now while Saul is chasing down God's anointed, David, we as readers are reminded yet again that Jonathan and David have successfully done what Saul has given up doing now. And when Jonathan had said in that covenant that he and David would be, that Jonathan would be second only to David, that they would have made a good 1-2 pair if you want kings who can defeat Philistines. And Saul is trying to destroy David in this process. So we're reminded yet again of why David is chosen and Saul has been rejected by Yahweh. So the action continues with David hurrying to get away from Saul. And this is a movie here. We could hear the music building up while Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture, literally surrounding them to capture them here. And again, reminding us of the Agag scene where Agag was captured but not killed. He was spared. Then something amazing happens. A messenger, but literally a Malach, an angel. Or is it an angel? And there's no other Malach anywhere in Samuel, as Falkman notes, although any reader can see that plainly. The word for Malach in Hebrew literally means messenger, sometimes translated angel, curiously from the Greek parallel angelos, which also means messenger, but transliterating it, you get the second half of the big city in Southern California, Los Angeles. And so the Hebrew here is not controlling the translation that we hear as angel. But in any event, it's a messenger. And since it seems to come out of nowhere into this rocky area, some scholars suggested that it is an angel, a supernatural being. But since there's nothing else in Samuel to suggest that, we can't reach that decision. But the fact that it seems to come out of nowhere suggests that it's there to protect David from Saul. And what the angel says is, hurry and come. The Philistines have made a raid on the land. And notice how generic that is. We don't know where or exactly what's going on. The word for raid here can also mean to strip, as in stripping off armor, or from as Jonathan stripped off his armor, or as the armor stripped off dead bodies here. But it can also mean a raid in several places, like stripping the land. And so with this generic claim that Saul is needed for other things, Saul stopped pursuing David and went against the Philistines, and therefore that place was called Rock of Escape. or also can mean rock of division, or slippery or smooth, or as some more suggest, crag of the divisions. And regardless of the name of it, yet again, David gets away. And David then went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-gedi, which we've noted before is the oasis to this day on the edge of the Dead Sea. So as we enter into chapter 24, we're entering in a new section, 24, 25, and 26 form a new unit. And we'll start looking at the parallels between 24 and 26 in our next video. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.